This artifact is from the early 1900s. It sits in its own humidity-controlled display case with UV filtering glass to help preserve it. It's made of felt and stuffed with wood wool known as excelsior. Stands 3 feet tall and weighs 6 pounds. Has blonde hair, black button eyes, and is dressed in a child's sailor suit to include the hat. Its faded face was once painted to resemble that of a jester's, and it holds a tiny stuffed toy in its lap. His name is Robert. He's considered to be one of the most haunted artifacts in Key West, and this is his story. Key West, October 1904. It's Robert Eugene Otto's birthday, and he's received the most incredible toy ever, a 3-foot doll dressed as a jester. He forms a bond instantly with the doll and becomes so enamored with it that he gives it his name, Robert, and declares that he will go by the name Gene from now on. He even dressed Robert in an old sailor outfit he had, and the two became inseparable. Robert became his companion, his BFF, his everything. His parents would hear him talking to Robert as he played, and it was all okay, until one day they heard a voice that wasn't Gene's. When they rushed into the room to see who else was with Gene, they only saw him and Robert along with his toys. They asked Gene who he was talking to, and his reply was,
Robert.
They again asked who he was talking to because they heard another voice, and his reply was,
Robert.
And this would happen many times, and each time, the only ones in the room would be Gene and Robert. And each time, Gene's response would be the same.
Robert.
Things started to get broken around the house, and when Gene was asked about it, his reply was,
Robert did it.
And this became a very common phrase to Gene, as he would blame it all on Robert every time something happened. Robert would stay busy when the Ottos weren't around. People passing by would report seeing Robert moving from window to window up in the turret tower, watching them. And many times, Robert would be put away in the loft to punish Gene for lying. And the servants and guests would hear the sounds of laughter, footsteps, and shuffling coming from upstairs. And when his parents would go and check, Robert would always be back in Gene's room. Some believe it was the work of mischievous spirits, while others whispered tales of magic and voodoo. These antics would go on for years, and the last straw came when Gene was 10. He woke his parents up one night screaming out of fear. They ran to his room and found his door locked, and from behind the door, they could hear Gene screaming for help, along with the sounds of crashes and bangs as if furniture and toys were being thrown around the room. Then it went silent. The door opened, and when they looked inside, it was as if a tornado had hit it. Toys were scattered around, broken, clothes thrown all over, and Gene was curled up in a ball of fear at the head of his bed. Robert, on the other hand, was sitting on the edge of the bed perfectly fine. Gene's parents asked him what happened, and he gave his same reply, Robert did it. And that was the last straw. They took Robert and locked him up in the loft, and this devastated Gene. The next day, they sent him away to boarding school. Gene went on to study architecture and art, and eventually moved to New York, where he lived for 2.5 years before moving to Paris. There, he met his wife, Annette Parker, who was there from New England to study music. The two married in Paris on May 3, 1930, and moved to New York to live. Gene worked as a furniture salesman while Anne performed shows in the Rainbow Room at the Rockefeller Center. Gene's mother would become very ill in the 1940s, and the couple would move back to Key West to help take care of her. Minnie Otto would die in 1945 at the age of 77. She left the house to her children, who all signed their rights over to Gene and Anne. Gene would go on to become a well-known artist in the area. He created the gallery at the Fort East Martello Museum and had plans to make his home a museum. He named his home the Artist House and was going to create a wax print of the artist's hands as a focal point for the house. But unfortunately, he never saw his vision come to life. Once Gene and Anne moved into his old childhood home, it wasn't long before Robert was found, and boy and doll were once again reunited. And yes, all the weird stuff happened again. Gene developed his instant attachment to Robert, and this time he even built Robert a room in the loft, complete with furniture, toys, and even his own stuffed animal. Anne, on the other hand, was not very fond of Robert and told Gene that he creeped her out and asked him to keep him up in the loft, which Gene would do. Robert, though, was not very fond of being put away, and when friends came to visit, he was always active, running around upstairs and moving things. The neighbors would talk about seeing Robert watching them from Gene's old bedroom, and every time Gene would go and check on him, he'd find Robert sitting in the chair next to the window in his old room. Gene spent a lot of time in the loft with Robert, painting and talking, and when Gene was away, Robert would play. He'd terrorize the school children walking by the house on their way to school by moving from window to window, watching them as they walked by. Many of them would start going across the street to walk or avoided the house altogether. Gene died on June 24, 1974, from Parkinson's disease. In the months leading up to his death, he spent the majority of that time in the loft with Robert. Anne sold the house to a friend and neighbor, William Geyser, and moved to Massachusetts, where she lived with her sister until she died 5 years later in January 1979 from pancreatic cancer. She left Robert with William and told him,
"That doll was Gene's best friend. Of course, he never had any other friends."
When the new family moved in, their 10-year-old daughter found Robert up in the attic and was ecstatic. She was happy and delighted to have a new doll. But soon, the happiness turned to fear as she would wake up in the middle of the night screaming because Robert was moving around her room. She told her parents that Robert wanted to hurt her, and eventually they'd had enough and sold the house to Myrtle Reuter. She lived there for 6 years with Robert, and all went well between them. At Christmas time, she would dress Robert in PJs and sit him next to the Christmas tree. Eventually, she sold the house in 1980 and moved to an apartment further in town, and she took Robert with her. And that's when things took a turn for the weird. In the beginning, everything seemed to be okay between her and Robert. But as time went on, Robert began acting up again. He started moving things around, moving from chair to chair. And eventually Myrtle would lock him in a closet when she'd gotten tired of his antics. And they lived like this for 20 years. But one day, when she had locked him away, she heard laughter coming from another closet. So she went to go check. And when she opened the door and looked inside, she was suddenly shoved inside, and the door was closed and locked behind her. She screamed for help, and eventually the door unlocked. When she looked out into the room, she saw Robert sitting in a chair next to the window instead of locked in the closet where she had left him. The next day, she paid a visit to the Fort East Martello Museum. She sat Robert down on a chair, and she said,
"This is Robert, and he's part of the Otto family, and I can't stand him being in my house anymore."
She then told the Art and Historical Society assistant director about what happened the night before, and she said,
"He's haunted, and I want him out of my house."
He suggested that she still keep Robert, but Myrtle was having nothing more to do with him. She filled the paperwork out to donate him and left. She died 3 months later. The Fort East Martello Museum is where Robert has called home since 1994. In the beginning, Robert was put away in a back storage area. People would hear about Robert and come in to request and see him, and eventually Robert would go out on display. People would come from all over to see him, and then report malfunctioning equipment such as their cameras and computers when they visited him. Strange coincidence? Or did Robert do it? Robert is also blamed for many other misfortunes, such as broken bones, car accidents, divorce, hospitalization, and many more. And all because these people disrespected him when they visited. Seems Robert does not like to be disrespected, and if you do so, you're taking a chance. It's not hard to give him respect. They even tell you when you first enter the museum how to do it. And they tell you, be respectful and ask permission before you take his picture. Will Robert curse you if you don't? Many seem to believe so, and have sent letters of apology begging Robert to remove whatever curse they had put on him. Some would even write and ask if he could curse someone else that had done them wrong. Since his arrival, Robert has received nearly 1,000 letters, and the museum keeps and documents every one of them for future reference. More in the know fact. Letters aren't the only thing Robert receives. When word got out that Robert had a sweet tooth, people started sending him peppermints and other candies, and not just by mail. They'd also leave them by his case, along with money and sometimes even joints. Robert has even received a positive letter from a woman who said she had nothing but the best of luck after visiting him. She didn't go into any details, only to say that she appreciated and thanked Robert. She referred to him as a demon whose role it was to teach people to ask permission, and that he's specifically a demon in charge of good manners. Say what? Thanks to the investigative work of a paranormal investigator and author, David Sloan, along with the team from the Key West Art and Historical Society, a little more is known about Robert, his origin, and those who took care of him. From the work, it was learned that Robert was made by a German toy company, the Steiff Company, around 1902, and was likely a window display and not a doll, and was also probably pretty expensive. One thing they're not sure of, though, is who gave Gene the doll. One story was that his grandfather brought it over to him from Germany as a gift. And another, which has more merit to it, is that his mother brought it over when she came from Germany in 1904. Minnie Otto's name was on the passenger list for the SS Graf Waldersee, the Hamburg American line, which was a transatlantic liner, just a month before Gene's 4th birthday in September 1904. But the million-dollar question is, how did Robert get possessed? And there are a couple of theories to this. One is perhaps a half-sibling or a child that was very close to Gene possessed Robert, creating this natural bond. The other thought is that voodoo of some sort was used to open a door that somehow did not get closed, and it allowed Robert to feed off of the energy and affection that Gene had for him. And when Gene gave Robert his name and his clothes, this sealed the deal. So, who could this half-sibling or child be? Well, let's take a look at the family, shall we? Thomas and Minnie Otto had 4 children, and they all lived to adulthood, so we know it wasn't them. And working for the Ottos was a couple from the West Indies named Emmeline and William Abbott. The Abbotts had worked for the Otto family since Thomas's father, and they're even buried in the Otto family plot in Key West. They had 2 children, and although there's no evidence to to prove it, there is cause to believe that Thomas and Emmeline had an affair, and a child was born from this. It was this child that died, and Emmeline used voodoo to transfer her soul to Robert. The other story is that the child that died was actually Emmeline and Williams, and like before, Emmeline used voodoo to transfer the soul to Robert. Either way, no matter who the child was, they would have been close to Gene. Staff members at both the museum and the artist house have said to have seen the apparition that looks like a little girl of mixed race, around 5 years of age, with long, brown, curly hair, wearing an old-fashioned type nightgown. She's been seen hanging around Robert at the museum or sitting on the staircase in the house. The artist house is also said to be frequented by another spirit, and it is that of Eugene Otto. It is believed that she came back when Robert left to protect those in her home from him should he return. She is usually seen walking down the staircase in the turret tower, wearing her wedding dress and never speaking a word. The artist house is now a bed and breakfast and has been operating in the Key West area since 1978. It's one of the oldest continuously operating guest house, built between 1890 and 1898 by Thomas Otto, and it's purple, my favorite color. Now, Robert has an enormous following with numerous Facebook pages and groups named after him. He's got websites, books, dolls, keychains, magnets, and you name it, he's got it. But for me, the question still remains. Did Robert do it? Robert, I would like to take your picture. If it's not okay, please do something. White House, huh? Mr. Otto, happy 101st birthday. This is from Bush. Did Gene live to be 101? Wow. May I take your picture, Robert, please? No movement. I'm going to assume that means yes. Thank you. I appreciate it. Poor thing. Thank you, Robert, for letting me take your picture and video. Enjoy your first birthday. Robert. Be nice to him. Should be seen.
What's the train full of fools blowing down their magnetic feet? The gypsy wagon he broke a pipe with lashing rain. So son, this ain't a dream, I'm more a serene thing. Senor, senor, you know that hearts are always willing. Give me a minute to get this together. I just gotta pick myself off the floor.